Thank you again, everybody, for joining us for our investigating research on campus. Vivian is going to go ahead and introduce our presenter today. Anyone that's in the building today, please go ahead and mute your phones. Make sure they're on silent. Since we are recording today, you can leave your camera off, but please keep yourself muted. We'll take questions at the end, at which point you'll be able to either put them in the chat or in mute. So, thank you. Vivian?
Hello. Dr. R. Scott Russell holds a BS degree in computer science from the University of Michigan. He earned a master's in kinesiology and PhD in athletic administration from Purdue University. His primary area of research is gender in sport. Expanding on that topic to include people who identify in a variety of ways seemed natural. During his research, Dr. Russell, quote, discovered that diversity didn't guarantee equity or inclusion. Being equitable didn't always address diversity or help people feel included, and that inclusion might be the most difficult of these three to accomplish. The ideal of diversity, equity, and inclusion is only reached when every member of a group has the same sense of belonging, even when there are many differences between the individuals who comprise that group. Dr. Scott Russell.
Great. Thank you very much. So before I get started, just a reminder to those of you who are in my class, there's a sign-in sheet. Make sure that you get credit for attendance today. So thank you very much, everybody, for
Please continue.
okay.
Very good.
So I'm not muted anymore?
You're perfect.
Oh, okay. So I should start over, or not too much? Okay. Yeah, so again, my interest in this topic really grew out of my research area, which has been gender in sport for probably 20 years now, 15 at least. And with the conversations that have taken place on campus, with my involvement in the DEI committee here on campus, collaborating with a number of my colleagues, I would name them, but I would leave people out, so I'm just not even going to start naming the list of people who I've talked with about this particular topic. But you know, a year and a half ago, we started to think about the possibility of offering a diversity, equity, and inclusion in sport class in sports management. At the time, that was part of a concentration. Sports management is now a major within the School of Business. That happened this year, and so this seemed like the right year to add a DEI in sport class as we were expanding the sports management program. So then, of course, the conversation was, you know, who should teach the class? And, you know, because we're kind of short on overage white guys on campus, you know, we're an underrepresented minority. I'm kidding, of course. You know, I mean, but honestly, personally, I struggled with that a little bit. Who should teach this class? I honestly didn't think that it should be me. But ultimately, again, speaking with a number of my colleagues, you know, the point became anybody should teach this class. That's really the point of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's a big part of what we're going to talk about, is that it shouldn't matter who's having the conversation. What should matter is who is having the conversation, the greater group, not just who's leading the conversation. So, thank you very much for your indulgence, and we'll dive in to the presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions when we get closer to the end. So let's see, I'm going to click someplace. There we go. So we'll start with a little, as I do with all of my classes, my students will tell you that I always start with a little bit of a historical perspective. I teach a class on the history of the Olympic Games. We start in ancient Greece. And so naturally for this topic, talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in sport in particular, wanted to spend at least a couple of minutes talking about or providing a little bit of a historical perspective on sport and diversity. And when we look at the Olympic Games, for example, and go back 3,000 years, and I had the privilege a couple of years ago of going to Greece and teaching a study abroad class with about 20 mountain students. And we started in Athens, and we got to go to the ruins in Olympia. And we were really able to do a real deep dive into the Olympic Games. And some of the things that the students learned, something that I've, of course, known for a while. This is a class that I've been passionate about for a long time. The original Olympic Games were men only. So from a diversity standpoint, really not very diverse. The competitions took place in the nude. The Greeks worshiped the human form. And so paying tribute to Zeus was part of the competition, and competing in the nude, the athletes were typically heavily oiled, trained vigorously for years for their competitions. They were very frequently very well compensated. This idea of amateur athletes in Greece is kind of a myth. The athletes were extremely well paid, very, very famous, and highly trained. But it wasn't a very diverse athletic scene in ancient Greece. So let's talk about the origins of collegiate sport. And again, not a lot of diversity here. So we're starting to see, again, some of the roots of some of the problems in athletics. So for example, with early collegiate sport for men. Early collegiate sport for men was very, very different than it was for women. It was all about glory for the individual, glory for the school. It was about money. It was about gambling. It was about drawing students to your school and being famous for being victorious. Records were kept. Stories were told about the heroes, the people who did really, really well in collegiate athletics. In fact, the Heisman Trophy, which is given every year to the top collegiate football player, is actually named after a guy who was paid $2,000 to play for the college that he played. He was 25 years old. He was a mercenary. His name was John Heisman, and he was paid $2,000 that year to play for West Virginia, and now the Heisman Trophy is named after him. So men's collegiate sport, again, not terribly diverse. Some inherent problems with the way that the NCAA manages men's collegiate sport. And I say that because if we look at the way that women's collegiate sport started, women's collegiate sport was for a very, very long time part of the educational process. The women who led women's collegiate sport were educators. They had PhDs. They were college faculty who understood the value of physical fitness. Now remember, there certainly was a time during the late 1800s, early 1900s where women weren't, the medical community was telling women that they weren't supposed to exercise. Women only had so much life in their body. They only had so much energy in their body. And if they wasted it on things like athletics, they wouldn't be able to have as many babies. And that was the prevailing wisdom of the medical community at the time. Well, of course, there were female educators who thought that that was a bunch of bunk, and that, of course, women should be active and fit and healthy. So that's really the background for women's collegiate athletics. It wasn't based on the school that you went to. It wasn't for the glory of the team. In fact, a lot of women's collegiate events were two schools getting together and then picking sides and playing whatever the sport was that day, whether it was soccer or softball or volleyball. And so that you weren't competing against another team, you were going and playing with another school or another team. So it's just a very, very different mindset for men's and women's athletics. So you have these two very different models of collegiate athletics, both operating separately and independently. So again, not very inclusive. And then what we see is, we see in the 1970s, we see something called Title IX. And Title IX was the piece of legislation that mandated that women have the same opportunities as men in the classroom, but that extended to collegiate athletics. And so what happened was that in 1982, all collegiate athletics became governed by the NCAA. And now we have one model. That one model is in the vision of the men's model of collegiate athletics, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But at least we had both male and female collegiate athletics under one umbrella. So it was at least becoming more diverse, more inclusive, a lot of those things that those words that we're really going to be focusing on. So what I want to turn your attention to for just a couple of minutes is a term that we've talked about in our DEI and sport class quite a bit, and that term is intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. Ms. Crenshaw is a graduate of Cornell, has a law degree from Harvard, has been a political activist and a law professor. She currently teaches law at both UCLA and Columbia. And her point about intersectionality is that nobody identifies in one single way. And so when we look at people and we look at physical characteristics, a lot of times we see different exterior physical characteristics, and those sometimes become labels by which we identify people. Now, there's a lot of other ways that people identify that might not be quite as obvious. So the question that I pose here is, how do you identify? And there's certainly a list of possible labels. It's not an exhaustive list. But another example, I think, is if you look at a group of faces. There are 45 faces on the screen here. And if you were to look at those faces and try to identify labels, right? And if you ask yourself, okay, let's see, how many men, how many women? Well, I happen to count them. There's 24 women and 21 men. So that's one label. That's one way that somebody could identify, okay? Do I happen to know if any of these people are transgender? No, I don't. I can only see their physical exterior. How many African Americans represented in this? Well, it sort of depends on your definition or how you believe. There's 13 or 14 African American faces there. How many people wearing glasses, right? These are all physical characteristics that someone might use as an identifier, right? How many people in that picture are gay? Well, we don't know. I don't see anybody with the word gay tattooed on their forehead, right? So that's, again, when we label, when we ask people to identify, right, we have to remember that there are both exterior forms of identification and there are also interior forms of identification. Personality traits. Is somebody an extrovert or an introvert? How many of these 45 people are extroverts and how many are introverts? I don't know, right? So the important thing to remember about intersectionality is that we may have a lot more similarities than we have differences because we can't see all of the differences and we can't see all of the similarities. And so that's something that we've really been talking a lot about in our DEI and sport class, because when you have sports teams, right, when you have a football team, 6'8", 700 pounds, no, they're not that big, but you know what I mean. I mean, they're just walking mountains of humanity sometimes, right? And then you've got this guy who's the kicker, who's, like 5'10", 145 pounds and can kick the ball 60 yards. So there's physical differences even on a football team. There are physical differences on every sports team when we talk about the different teams on our own campus, and look at the way that people identify themselves. Sure, I'm a member of a team, but I have other identifiers that I use to describe myself. So this idea of intersectionality is in our class. We've really decided this is really very, very central to the discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you can wrap your head around intersectionality, then you can really be somebody who's a very productive part of the conversation, I think. So this idea of inclusion, I mentioned, Vivian mentioned in my introduction that, diversity and equity, those seem to be the things that we can put our fingers on pretty easily. Inclusion is a little bit tougher. And so that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more here. But, keep in mind that the idea with inclusion isn't just being part of a group. It's not good enough to just have somebody be part of a group. Okay, that's diversity. Inclusion is when you actually feel like you're part of the group, where you feel like you're exactly the same as the other members of that group, regardless, again, of those labels that we get from intersectionality. So that's really what we're talking about with inclusion. And again, just a diagram that I thought for me visually, some people are visual learners, right? I mean, as an educator, I'm supposed to be able to talk to students who learn in different ways. So for those of you that are a little bit more visual, here's a visual representation of what I'm talking about, is that, the pieces of the puzzle, that's just diversity. If you just throw a bunch of different colors of, pieces of the puzzle on the table, but it's when they actually link together, that's when you have actual inclusion. And so for teams, the goal of a team is to win, right? Score more goals, swim a little faster, run a little faster, right? Score more points. That's the goal of a team. So ideally in sport, you would hope that the rules of play for any sport are colorblind. Doesn't matter what some of those exterior identifiers might be. That sport is a level playing field for everybody, regardless. Now, then we have to get into the conversation of disability. And I think that when we talk about inclusion, and one of the things that we've been talking about in our class very, very recently, is that becomes a little bit more difficult. And it's something that we need to continue to have a conversation about. So in other words, if, let's just say that somebody at Mount St. Mary College who is physically disabled and is in a wheelchair wants to join the men's basketball team. Right now, I don't think we could accommodate that. The team has tryouts. Some athletes make the team, some athletes don't, right? So how do we, in sport, address the issue of inclusion with disability? And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's going to be an ongoing conversation. When we look at inclusion in professional sport, one of the things that we've discovered in our class is that it appears that women's sport has, at least at this point, been more inclusive of the LGBT community. You can list a few men. I've listed a few here. We had Jason Collins, our athletic department. I don't know if it was a seminar or what the right word to use is, but the Skyline Conference had a virtual seminar with Jason Collins last spring, where a lot of our athletes got to hear Jason tell his story about being an openly gay professional athlete in the NBA. And it was really, really great to hear Jason's story. Some of you may recognize the name Michael Sam. Carl Nassib is actually a current NFL player who came out as gay last spring. Lou Prokop is in the NHL. So these are some current male athletes who have come out as gay recently. But the list is still relatively short. If you look at the list on the women's side, for me, Billie Jean King is, one of the all-time heroes, regardless of what you're talking about with sport. If you're talking about, bringing professional opportunities for women, if you're talking about, increasing the level of pay, increasing, the media support, Billie Jean King is always going to be one of the all-time heroes for me. But if you look at the WNBA right now, there are a lot of very prominent superstars in the NBA, in the WNBA, who are openly gay. Brittany Griner, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, her relationship with Megan Rapinoe, I think is pretty well known. So So, but let's address that quickly. Don't want to spend a ton of time here, but you know, historically, a lot of women who participated in sport at a particular level were breaking gender stereotypes to begin with. If you look at Babe Dietrichson, you know, this is a photo of Babe Dietrichson at the 1928 Olympics in Amsterdam. And at the time, I mean, you look at that and you think, okay, yeah, it's an athletic young lady. She probably did pretty well. At the time, Babe had a really bad reputation. She was too muscular. Her hair was too short. She didn't look like a girl. And the media tore her apart for it. Now, by today's standards, of course, we would, I hope, accept her accomplishments on the field and not be as derogatory about her physical appearance. But at the time, Babe Dietrichson really suffered a lot of very negative press because of her appearance. So because of those early role models who had to overcome gender stereotypes to begin with, it was easier for women to be openly gay, people like Billie Jean King. And so there were more role models for female athletes to see than there were for men. So that's a big part of why in today's sport, we see more acceptance of LGBTQ community in women's sport than we do with the men. So I want to talk about professional sport and cultural diversity specifically, and what these sports are doing to move the needle a little bit. What are some of these professional organizations doing in their sports to work on cultural diversity, recognizing that there's work to be done? So we'll focus on really the four major professional organizations. We'll take a quick look at the NCAA, and then we'll finish up this part of the discussion by looking at the Olympic Games. Because while you might think that the Olympic Games are sort of inherently non-diverse, right? Because the teams come from individual countries. There's China, there's Russia, there's the US, there's Brazil, there's England, right? You might think that those are homogeneous groups. The International Olympic Committee is actually doing a lot of work to try to move the thought on diversity and inclusion forward. And so we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes when we get to the Olympic Games. But when you look at some of the programs that are being put in place by professional organizations, now remember, these professional leagues are all run by commissioners. So while the teams themselves compete against each other, they do have a governing body, if you will. They do have an organizational structure that provides rules and input and structure for how the league is going to be run. So in the NFL, for example, recently hired Jonathan Bean is now the Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the NFL. But something that the NFL has been doing for almost 20 years now is called the Rooney Rule. The Rooney Rule is named for Dan Rooney. The Rooney family has been a big part of the Pittsburgh Steelers for a long time. There was Art Rooney, then there was Dan Rooney, now there's Art Rooney Jr. So the Rooney family has been a part of the Pittsburgh Steelers for a really long time. And Dan Rooney was instrumental in continuing the conversation about diversity within the NFL. And so when the NFL adopted this rule, they named it for Dan Rooney. And the rule specifically says that for every head coaching position, a team has to interview at least 2 external minority candidates. Now, that doesn't guarantee that they're going to get the job, but they at least get a seat at the table. For assistant coaching positions, they have to interview at least 1, and again, external, not somebody from inside the organization, but an external candidate. And while you might think that, okay, well, that's just fluff, they don't have to do anything about it. You know, I'll tell you what, Mike Tomlin, who has now been coaching the Pittsburgh Steelers for over 10 years, got a seat at the table because of this rule. Wasn't even on, you know, the short list, the long list, however you want to refer to it. Mike wasn't on anybody's list, but the Steelers brought him in because of the Rooney Rule. And Mike nailed the interview, and has been now the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers for a long time. So that's a good example of the Rooney Rule working the way that it's supposed to. And there are other programs. The Bill Walsh Diversity Coaching Fellowship brings coaches who are interested in being future coaches in the sport of football, not necessarily just in professional football, but in the college ranks, and provides training for people who would like to be coaches in football, or maybe they're coaching at the high school level and they'd like to move up and be college coaches. So it's a coaching fellowship program. There are different teams that have diversity coaching fellowships, and there's a relationship with the NFL and the historically Black colleges and universities, the HBCU. They have a forum that they do that's helping to provide careers for HBCU football players in the NFL. In the NBA, they've had a chief diversity officer since 2015. And in fact, the WNBA really got a lot of press. There was a lot of media coverage about their stance on social issues. Having Black Lives Matter printed right on the NBA court, as you can see in the photo that I've included here. The NBA Foundation contributes $300 million to combat systemic inequities and injustice. 23 NBA teams provided facilities during the 2020 national election, polling places, places where people could go where they would feel safe to vote, and where there was plenty of room to set up lots and lots of voting machines. The NBA is also part of a global inclusion council that's been going on for about 5 years. And the NBA also works very closely with the WNBA on a women's leadership initiative. And I think it's also noteworthy that they were the first professional sport to not just join in the NYC Pride March, but publicize that. They put it all over their website. It was, they gave it a lot of promotion. They didn't just fly under the radar. They really, put it out there as something that they were proud of and a big part of their organization. Cultural diversity in Major League Baseball. We're going to talk a little bit more about Major League Baseball in just a minute, but there is a chief people and culture officer, and again, it's a relatively new position for baseball. They just hired Michelle Meyer-Ship within the past year. But they do have what they consider to be diversity pipeline programs, where they are working to provide athletes, underrepresented athletes, with an opportunity to improve their baseball skills and move into the major leagues at some point. The Jackie Robinson Foundation provides 30 four-year college scholarships per year to minority athletes. And so Major League Baseball is very active in cultural diversity. The WNBA, very much like the NBA, dedicated this season to social justice, social issues. Again, also had Black Lives Matter printed on the floors of their arena. They wore "Say Her Name" on their warm-up jerseys in tribute to Breonna Taylor, and had a lot of conversation and a lot of discussion about Black Lives Matter and the social issues that were going on around the country at the time. And I've listed some other programs that the WNBA sponsors. Very specifically, Dream in Color is a program for women of color who want to go into business. They want to own their own businesses, and so this is a program that the WNBA sponsors to provide women of color with seed money for their startups or for their small businesses to help them get off the ground and get started. Apex is a program for Asian professionals that's very similar. And then if you might have even seen the Nike promotion that's been running for about a year now, called Her Time to Play. Nike's put together some ads, you know, the types of ads that you typically see at the Super Bowl or during March Madness or something like that, that really push the idea that women can compete in sport, do compete in sport, and absolutely should be included in the conversation about who's an athlete and who's not. So in the NCAA, and you know, this is something that, again, we could probably talk about a lot, but I wanted to highlight a couple of sort of our superstars here on campus. The senior woman administrator on our campus is Samantha Howe, who's also the softball coach. But this is a position mandated by the NCAA so that women have a voice in the senior administration of an athletic department. Now, this is a program that's been in place since 1981. That's the good news. The bad news is that currently there are over 15% of Division I schools that don't have a single woman in their senior administration. So that's 15% of the Division I schools who don't have an SWA because they just simply don't even have a woman in their senior administration. So there's still work to do there. A new program that Mount St. Mary College, I'm pleased to say, is participating in. It's called the Athletics Diversity and Inclusion Designee. And so that's somebody who is employed by the athletic department, who is the diversity and inclusion designee for that athletic department. In our campus, that's Haley Anthony. Those of you who are athletes, I'm sure you're extremely familiar with Haley. She's extremely talented at helping those of you who turn an ankle, stub a toe, whatever, crack a fingernail, I don't know, whatever it is that Haley does. She's really, really good at her job. In fact, both Samantha and Haley have had an opportunity to come and speak in our class, and that was those were both excellent class sessions. Cultural diversity in the Olympics. The big thing that I want to focus on here is that, you know, the Olympics, remember, includes about 10,000 athletes. In fact, I think we approached 11,000 athletes at the most recent games. But very noteworthy that the IOC has started to include mixed gender events. And not just mixed doubles in tennis, that's certainly sort of an easy one, but they've started to include things like mixed relays in track and field and in swimming, mixed doubles in table tennis, just a variety of different sports where both genders are competing together for the same medal, for the same recognition for their country. And I think that's a really terrific move, you know, a good step forward by the IOC. So I want to talk about pay equity because, again, like the social issues that we've been discussing, Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, things like that, pay equity was a big topic of discussion really 2 years ago during the Women's World Cup in 2019. And I think that there were some people who maybe misunderstood what the ladies were talking about when they were talking about pay equity. They weren't talking about should professional women's soccer players be paid the same as Lionel Messi and Ronaldo and people. That's not what they were talking about. We'll look at that in just a second. What they were talking about is if you compete for your national team, if you play for the United States of America at the World Cup, there's an organization there, there's an organizational structure that provides money for training, for travel, for coaching, and things like that, that's separate from the professional organizations. And so the point that the women had was, why are we being given, I guess it was about a quarter, maybe a third, it was a noticeably smaller amount. Why are we being given fewer resources, less money, less travel, inferior facilities over the men's team? Men's team didn't even qualify for the last World Cup. The women have won the World Cup 4 times. They're the best team in the world. So why aren't they being compensated at the same level? At least at the same level. In my opinion, they should be getting more, but at least at the same level. So that was really the issue for women's soccer. Now, as far as pay equity is concerned, this has been a big topic in women's professional sports over 50 years. Billie Jean King and 8 of her colleagues left the women's tennis tour because at the time they were expected to be amateurs. They were expected to go to things like Wimbledon and the French Open and the US Open and not receive any prize money at all. They were expected to be amateurs. And Billie Jean King said, that's not how it's going to work. And she took 8 of her colleagues and they spun off this new league that was sponsored by Virginia Slims. And Billie Jean King will just flat out say, yep, I didn't want to be sponsored by a cigarette company, but you know what? That's who showed up at the table. That's who ponied up the money so that we could have a professional league. We could start paying the top female tennis players to have a professional circuit. And you know what? It worked. And within just a few years, the women were back in the WTA and they were earning prize money. It wasn't the same as the guys, but they were earning prize money. And then in the early 2000s, Venus Williams, Serena Williams is obviously very well known, maybe the most talented, most successful female tennis player of all times. Venus was no slouch. Venus has won a lot of majors herself. But for me personally, her greatest accomplishment was her work to demand that women get the same prize money at the major tournaments like Wimbledon, the French Open. And not coincidentally, in 2006, when Venus won Wimbledon, it was the first time that a major tournament was paying the female champion the same amount as the men. Now, Venus had to go out and actually win on the court to have that happen. But she was also the one in the boardroom and in the background making that happen for women in tennis, but also as a role model for other sports. And so if you look, again, if you look at the salary economics, it isn't that women's sport is going to demand the same salaries, right? I mean, LeBron James is earning $41 million this year. But the entire WNBA is operating on 60 million. So one guy is earning about 2/3 of what the entire WNBA is. So the economics are very different. That's understandable. But you know what? WNBA is continuing to grow. They made a really smart move a couple of years ago by moving to smaller stadiums, actually. Because if you're going to compete in front of 8,000 to 10,000 people, why sit in a 25,000 to 30,000 seat stadium? It looks empty. But if you sit in an 8,000 to 10,000 seat stadium, it's full, it's noisy, it's fun. And you know what? The fan base for the WNBA is growing. And I think they're really moving in the right direction. They're doing a great job. And pay equity for women, unfortunately, ladies, this is not something that's brand new. These are statistics from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics that women still, even in this day, earn 82% of men. In other words, you have to work an extra 42 days a year. If you're an African-American woman, I'm sorry to say that number moves to 214 extra days a year. And if you're a Latina, 293 extra days. And these are numbers that come from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Okay. So let's talk, just got a few more minutes. We'll get, we're approaching the end here, but so who is getting it right? Right? If I'm sort of spreading doom and gloom about diversity, equity, and inclusion in sport, who is getting it right? So was Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball? That was a good thing, right? Right? When the NCAA took over control of all athletics in 1982, that was a good thing. That was a positive thing, right? At least that's the spin we like to put on it. Well, let me tell you about some of the numbers that you might not know. So that was 1947 that Jackie broke the color barrier. 4 years later, the Negro Leagues disappeared. Why? Because all the top black players were leaving the Negro Leagues and they were going to Major League Baseball. The fans for the Negro Leagues wanted to go watch the best black players play baseball. So they were going to the Major Leagues. The Negro Leagues couldn't stay in business because they weren't getting any fans. So what do we have now in Major League Baseball? We've got under 8% of professional baseball players are now African American. That's approximately 80 players. There's about 1,000 baseball players on all of the rosters of the major league teams. When the Negro Leagues existed, they employed 4,000 players between 1920 and 1950, 1951. So Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. Good for black athletes in baseball? Maybe not, right? You know, what if the Negro Leagues had continued to grow and we'd had thousands of black athletes employed playing baseball? The numbers in collegiate athletics. Prior to the merger, 90% of women's college teams were coached by women. Today, 45%. Why is that? Because male athletic directors hire male coaches. And when the NCAA absorbed women's sport, all of those women now had a guy that they reported to. They all had male bosses. That was, so was that a good thing? Not necessarily. So I'll sort of finish this by giving you a couple of examples of places that I think they're doing it right. I had an opportunity to go to Australia a few years ago with my good friend Mike Fox and study the differences between how Australia treats female athletes and how the United States does. And in particular, we looked at professional sports. We actually went and visited the Sydney Sixers. And I blew it today. I left my little, I've got a couple of little souvenirs that I put out on my dining room table so I could bring them and show them to you. And I left it. Of course, you know exactly where they are. They're on my dining room table still. But we went and visited the Sixers. And it's one organization. It has a men's team and it has a women's team. And they have a men's schedule and they have a women's schedule. But they have one big complex with weight rooms and practice fields. And it's just one big organization. And cricket's the biggest sport, the biggest pro sport in all of Australia. And they were very, very profitable last year. And that's just sort of the model that they have. So my question then is, you know, what if? What if we had the Yankees and the Yankees was really two teams? It was the boys and it was the ladies, right? Playing baseball. Now this is the Yankees this year. They went out to Iowa and played the Field of Dreams game. And of course, that's, you know, League of Your Own, Tom Hanks and all of that. But I mean, what if? I mean, that's the model that cricket is using. And don't think for a minute that cricket's not, sure, you're all Yankees fans and you're like, well, you know, nothing's as big as the Yankees. Well, cricket's pretty big in Australia. So it's not different. And then the last example I'll give you, and we'll wrap things up, is in New Zealand. They have a team called the All Blacks. Now, before you tell me that that's horrible and it's the same as the Washington Redskins, in fact, in New Zealand, they're called the All Blacks as a symbol of respect. And I'm going to show you a 45-second video in just a second that's going to explain what I mean by that. In the logo for the All Blacks, they also include the Black Ferns, which is the female equivalent. Again, this is a sports organization that has both a men's side and a women's side. The men are the most successful male rugby team on the planet, and the women are the most successful female rugby team on the planet. And you can see their jerseys. They're both teams are sponsored by AIG. I mean, they're virtually identical, right? They have the same sponsors. It's the same overall franchise. One's a women's team and one's a men's team. Now I'm going to play again, this is a very, very short video. This is called the Haka. The Haka is done by both the men and the women. This happens to be a clip of the guys. The Haka was a way to inspire warriors going into battle. This was a way of intimidating the foe, the opponent. The Haka is done in a variety of different ways. This happens to be a short, less than a minute clip. There are some that are 4 or 5 minutes long. But the point of the Haka is that everybody on the team participates. Every player on the team, regardless of your ethnic origin, I mean, you'll see they get into it. When we talk about inclusivity, this is as inclusive as it gets. The tongue is a sign of disrespect. And the All Blacks are comprised of athletes from a variety of different origins and ethnicities. And again, you know, the most successful rugby team on the planet. Not a coincidence, as far as I'm concerned. So I'll sort of leave you with this. You know, Nelson Mandela for me is somebody who symbolizes a lot of things. Nelson Mandela was a huge fan of sport. Nelson Mandela sponsored and promoted rugby as a way for South Africa to move out of apartheid and to become an integral part of the world. In fact, at the time that Nelson became the president of South Africa after spending 27 years in prison, the national rugby team was almost entirely white. And he still promoted that team. So Nelson Mandela's words about sport has the power to change the world, has the power to inspire. You know, for me, that's really what sport should be all about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, hopefully sport can be the thing that does do the right things and does bring people together to be both, not both, but to be all of those three, to be diverse, to have equity, and also to have a sense of inclusion. And so that's going to wrap things up, and I'm happy to take any questions. John, were there any questions in the chat or? Not yet. Okay. Repeat the question, just sure.
So you touched on it a little bit when you were talking about intersectionality. You know, we see different levels of equity and inclusion throughout, like you compared the NBA versus WNBA. But I feel like where even more of a gray area comes in is with transgender athletes. And not that I'm asking you for your direct opinions, but is that something in your professional opinion that you think is getting enough of a voice in sport?
Well, I think that it's certainly getting more of a voice now. In fact, and there's so many things I could have included in this talk. I didn't want it to turn into a 3-hour snooze fest. But you know, for example, there was an athlete in the Olympics who was a transgender female. In other words, this is somebody who at a certain time in that person's life, they competed as a male weightlifter. And so then when he transitioned to she, of course, she didn't have the same levels of testosterone that she had when she had been male. So she didn't lift the same amounts that she had lifted previously when she'd been a male weightlifter. You know, I think that got a fair amount of press, you know, during the Olympics. I think athletes, as they continue to compete, I think it's something that there's going to be more and more conversation about. You know, the conversations that we've had in our class, you know, we've talked about the fact that it's tough. You know, right now our sports systems are set up to be either a boy or a girl. There isn't something in between right now. And so if you are somebody who has transitioned, you have to be one or the other. What if someday we have transgender athletes and those transgender athletes have their own professional leagues or their own professional opportunities? You know, we're not going to get there tomorrow, next week, next month, but I think at the very least, continuing to have conversations about that moves the idea forward. So yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up.
Excellent question.
Really interesting talk, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Barbara.
I'm really fascinated by the idea of these men's and women's teams being of the same team, like unified.
Very, very prevalent in Australia.
I can just see a lot of advantages of that.
Yeah. We were really struck. We went. I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yeah,
but we went to a Sixers game. Cricket for me, I'd almost rather watch paint dry, right? I don't know cricket. David Kennett was my cricket conduit. But we would go, and there were so many. We would go to a women's game, and there were so many instances of a dad bringing his two daughters, you know, or the other way around, right? I mean, it was so non-gender specific because there was both a men's team and a women's team.
And you can see how it would address all those inequities that you talked about the things about unequal facilities and pay, et cetera, et cetera. But so when I was thinking about, well, how do you make that happen? There seem to be a lot of barriers to based on how our sports teams are set up. Were those teams founded as inclusive of male and female, or were they separate ownerships who then joined later on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is that they've evolved into where they are right now. They weren't always that way. Now remember that Australia is inherently different than the United States to begin with. Australia is a place where the Europeans went not because of opportunity and for religious freedom. They went there because they stole a loaf of bread and then they got shipped away a nine-month boat ride to go live in a penal colony in Australia. And so what happened is because 90% of those people were men and only 10% were women, women had a much, much higher value in Australian culture, really from the very start, than what we saw here in the United States. And so then as sport became more popular, there have been professional opportunities for women in Australia to compete in sports since the 1890s, in bicycling and in tennis initially, than in golf. So women have had much greater opportunity. The women had the right to vote in Australia in the 1880s, 40 years before women in the United States did. So the Australian culture has approached female identity, sports, differently than the Americans have. So the short answer to your question is no, they haven't always been this way. It's been an evolving thing, but it's something that the Australian culture embraces so much that now it's as if you can't have a successful team without having both.
Yeah, I'd love to see someone here try that.
Yeah.
Because it does seem like in the long run, we have so many advantages over keeping these teams separated. You have two New York pro basketball teams, but they're playing on a completely different schedule, and they're really not. If you're a fan of one, it doesn't make you a fan of the other.
Right.
It's
yeah. I mean, what if we had a ladies, Los Angeles Lakers? Sure, I'd still like to watch LeBron James play, but I like watching Brittany Griner play too. So yeah. Well, what if we did something like that? It's difficult to move from the sports system that we have now in the United States. Again, with Australia, again, keep in mind that in Australia, there were so many Australians who they love Great Britain. They love England. They celebrate the Queen's birthday for a week in Australia. So of course they adopted British sports. So the whole sports system there is really, very, very different. It would take a lot to change the American culture and to have something like. I was really impressed with Australia. It was really, really, and I didn't know much about it at all before I went. It was really very impressive.
Thanks.
You have a question in the chat.
In the chat, okay. Sure.
All right, George asked, this item relates to the less than desirable consequences of integrating baseball or the NCAA's influence on women's sports. Are these problems about the decisions themselves, or the fact that the MLB and NCAA were controlled by those whose dispositions and organizations were perhaps not yet prepared to engage in authentic integration?
Well, I'll thank George for that short and succinct question. I think that the challenge, and I'll speak mostly about the NCAA because that's where I've done the most research, is that for a number of years there was a body called the AIAW that was basically the women's NCAA, and it was run by women. And if you look at the leadership of that organization, they all had PhDs. They were all highly educated, and they valued education first and sport second, even though they were administering sport at the collegiate level. And so, for me, I think the challenge is that my personal opinion is that the NCAA doesn't value academics the way that I think it should. I think it values money. I think that you don't have to look any further than $1.1 billion a year for their college basketball contract to know that the NCAA values money. Now, sure, they've got a lot of great programs. Well, they should. They got tons of money. But I think that the model that the women were using that was heavily focused on academics first, I think that was, in my mind, as a collegiate educator, that was the better model. But then when the two were merged, what happened was that all of those women who had previously been the women's athletic director or in a leadership position, they all reported to a new male boss. And that changed the nature of collegiate athletics, in my mind. Any other questions? So these guys are all smart. They know exactly when class ends. They know not to ask me a question 1 minute before class ends because they know that I'll go off and they'll be 5 minutes late getting to their next class. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us for our presentation on equity, diversity,